Proverbs 13:20 says, "He who walks with the wise will become wise." I'm Dan Chappa, and Turretinfan and I have been friends for many years, and we've learned a lot from each other, including how to debate opposing views while loving the person. We share a foundation in the essentials of the Christian faith and a love of God and His Word. Here we'll dive deep into the Bible and present both Calvinism and Arminianism and the precise points of disconcurrence. Hopefully the contrast will bring you clarity. Welcome to Disconcurring Theo Amigos. Hey Turretinfan, how's it going?
It's going great. How about yourself?
Not bad. Well, it's been a nice summer so far. We've gone on a lot of roller coasters and stuff like that, and a lot of little trips with the family. So things have been going well. Yeah,
Excellent.
Hope you're having a nice summer.
So far, so good.
Very cool. So I guess we left off last time. We talked about Romans chapter 11 at the end, where it was, from him and to him and through him, or through him and to him are all things. And out of that came up a couple different passages. I think Proverbs 16:4 was one of them, and we can start there. And then I think there was Proverbs 26:10, and then Isaiah 44, starting around verse 21. So I guess, does that sound like a plan? Should we just go through those three texts?
Sounds great.
All right. So Proverbs 16:4. Why don't you take the lead on it? This is probably more of a Calvinist favorite, so why don't you go ahead and take the lead, and then we can discuss Proverbs 16:4.
Sure. I would preface this discussion with a comment about the context. So Proverbs is famously a book of wisdom, and a lot of that, in terms of the wisdom literature, a lot of it is sometimes practical information that's expressed in practical terms, not always a theological exposition like one would find in Paul's epistles. So an example from the previous chapter: he that's greedy of gain troubles his own house, but he that hates gifts will live, is it was an example of this. It's a proverb that has some practical implication, being if you're greedy, if you have avarice, you're causing problems for yourself. But actually, if you avoid receiving these gifts from people, you can actually prolong your life. And it's not an absolute statement. It's kind of a relative statement, or a statement about a general truth, as opposed to trying to set down some theological law per se. But there are some themes throughout Proverbs that are pretty central. One of them is right there at the last verse of chapter 15. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. So the idea of this emphasis on the fear of the Lord and the connection to wisdom is one that starts from the very beginning of Proverbs, and is really woven throughout the book. When we come to Proverbs 16, we're in a section where it's sometimes not perfectly clear how much of the context informs a particular verse. The verses are pretty logically, generally speaking, the verses in our English Bible have been pretty logically divided out into separate thoughts, although sometimes the thoughts are interlinked. So just to read this particular pericope in my mind anyway, one way of dividing up this chapter is to look at verses 1 through 9 as at least somehow interrelated. Although there are individual thoughts that are presented, there's an overarching theme in here. And the theme starts in verse 1. The preparations of the heart in man, and the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. Then it goes down to verse 9. It says, a man's heart devises his ways, but the Lord... Go ahead.
I'm sorry. So what translation are you using?
The King James Version?
Okay. I'll pull that up. All right, go right on ahead. I got it now.
So the preparations of the heart in man and the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. Verse 9, a man's heart devises his way, but the Lord directs his steps. A divine sentence is in the lips of the king, his mouth transgresses not in judgment. So you can see there's some parallel between the content of 9 and 10 and the content of verse 1. And on the other hand, the link is not always clear. So the preparations of the heart in man and the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. All the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirits. That's verse 2. Verse 3, commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established. 4, the Lord has made all things for himself. Yes, even the wicked for the day of evil. Verse 5, everyone that's proud in heart is abomination to the Lord. Though hand join in hand, he shall not be unpunished. Verse 6, by mercy and truth iniquity is purged, and by the fear of the Lord men depart from evil. Verse 7, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes his enemies to be at peace with him. Verse 8, better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right. And verse 9, a man's heart devises his way, but the Lord directs his steps, as we previously mentioned. So there are, one thing that needs to be acknowledged up front is the context here is overall, it's a call to do what's right. That's the main point, really boiled down. That's the main point of this section. But there's a number of portions of this that seem to put a lot of onus on the man. So, for example, verse 5, everyone that's proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. And he's not going to, even though it says hand joined in hand, he shall not be unpunished, meaning essentially, even if these proud people unite with each other, God will still punish them. And then there's a suggestion that it's by mercy and truth that iniquity is purged, and by the fear of the Lord, men depart from evil, such that at verse 7, if a man's ways please the Lord, he makes his enemies to be at peace with him, seeming to put sort of, if man does this, then God will do that. And then verse 8, which is basically saying that it's better not to focus so much on getting a lot, more important to focus on being righteous. And as well, we see this in verse 3, commit your works unto the Lord and your thought will be established. Again, that seems like, man does this, committing his works, and God does something by kind of establishing the person's thoughts, meaning that God kind of helps these works that are committed to him to come to fruition. And embedded in this to some extent in the center of all of this is this statement that the Lord made all things for himself, yes, even the wicked for the day of evil. And I suppose, certainly standing by itself, this is a verse that should give a little bit of pause, both to Calvinists and non-Calvinists, partly because as Calvinists, at least confessional Calvinists, we often will explicitly say that God is not the author of sin, or God is not the author of evil. And we mean something very specific by that, but getting a call, I decline it.
Oh, no worries.
What we mean by that is something very specific with respect to the relationship of God and sin and evil. But we also have to tackle this statement that God made everything for himself, including the wicked for the day of evil, which appears to, on one practical level, one way to look at this is to say that that God has established a principle that the wicked will be punished. Looking at as a kind of explained at verse 5, even if you're proud and you join with other people, you're still going to eventually be punished. So the idea would be, that idea looks more like God made all things for himself, even the day of evil for the wicked. Or in some places you talk about people being cast into hell, which was created for the devil and his angels. as opposed to saying that the devil and the angels were created for hell. But here the wording is flipped. It's God made things for himself, including he made for himself the wicked for the day of evil, which suggests that God not only has a plan, not only planned the day of evil to deal with the wicked, but he actually planned the wicked to have a role on the day of evil. And that's the part that's, that's the part that creates, I think, a bigger problem for a non-Calvinist if the non-Calvinist is taking a view of God that God in no sense desires that there be wicked people or that they do wicked things. Now, if someone's a non-Calvinist and they can still somehow say, well, God does intend for there to be wicked people, and he does have a purpose for wickedness, and one of those purposes is for this day of evil, then that's that would, I guess, not necessarily, this verse wouldn't necessarily be brought up in that kind of debate with that particular non-Calvinist position. I guess another final question might be, what does this mean that God made everything for himself, including the wicked for the day of evil? Because the wicked for the day of evil could be talking about the wicked, the day of evil there could refer to the punishment that the wicked will receive, which it seems to be referring to in verse 5. Or it could be the wicked who will do evil to other people, thereby bringing the punishment upon those people. In other words, like in the history of the judges, there were frequently foreign nations that were brought to punish the people of Israel for falling away from God. So in that case, those wicked people served a purpose for punishing the Israelites, but ultimately, whether we understand it as the day of evil being the day of judgment for those wicked people, or we understand it as the wicked being there to punish or chastise others for doing things that are wrong or for not fearing God properly. Either way, for the purpose of a Calvinist debate, the issue is the same, which is, it seems as though God is taking credit for the existence of wicked, and that he has a purpose that's self-referential. In other words, the first part of the verse, he made all things for himself. It's not simply that he has a response to wickedness, but that's actually built into his plan, and it has a purpose in his glorification, in his self-exaltation. So I think that's basically the reason for bringing it up.
Yeah, thank you for that overview. Very helpful. So I see where you're coming from here, or I think I see. So before we get into the systematics at all, so I think it's important to understand what exactly this text is saying. Let's isolate to verse 1 first. And before we get to 1 itself, I think we can at least agree what's happening with verse 3. Commit your works unto the Lord, and your thoughts will be established. And verse 9, the man's heart devises his way, but the Lord directs his steps. So in verse 3 and verse 9, there's this idea of, the man's heart devises his way, and then the Lord establishes his steps. And the way I distinguish that is like, our choices are kind of these mental resolutions, but they don't, just because I choose to go to Japan or something like that doesn't mean that I can actually go unless, I have the money for it, and there's no problem with the plane, and, there's lots of things that I don't control. And so I take it in that sense that everything, God has to uphold everything else and make everything work out for my plans to work out. And in 16:1, it looks like there's a translation question that we probably need to address, because it seems like, and this is actually going to come up again in verse 4, but you use the King James, which says, the preparation of the heart in man, comma, and the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. But almost every other translation seems to go the other way. That the plans and reflections of the heart belong to man. The plans of the mind and orderly thinking belong to a man. The preparation of the man of heart is in man. The reflections of the heart belong to mankind. Right, like almost every other translation is going the other way. The ESV says the plans of the heart belong to man. Right, so it that would be more in line with what we see in verses 3 and in verse 9, where the person, the man, devises his way. In other words, comes up with a mental resolution, but the Lord directs his steps, right? And so the external part is from the Lord. So I guess I take it that way. But this is important because it doesn't seem like we're on the same page in terms of what exactly is being said.
Okay. Let's see. Let's see if I can nail this down at all.
Yeah, I'll look it up in Blue Letter Bible.
So
go ahead. Well, I'll just first off just admit that I have studied a little bit Hebrew, but not enough that I knew I'm far stronger in Greek than I am in Hebrew.
So I think I'm looking. One thing I would like to point out in terms of this, the history of the text for the King James Version, the underlying English text that they were improving on is usually the Bishop's Bible, which was a 1568 translation or so. I don't remember exactly, somewhere around there. But and the text there in the Bishop's Bible was, "A man may well purpose a thing in his heart, but the answer of the tongue comes of the Lord." That is different from, at least from the way that I'm reading the King James Version. But let me check about the King James Version, the 1611 text, to see if it's a difference in one of the updates. There were some changes between the 1611 and the 1769 that we typically use, and I think is reflected in the version I was reading. So in terms of nailing down where this came from, so the 1611 did have the same parsing. So it seems, if I'm reading this correctly, the main difference, let's say, between the Bishops and the King James Version is the question of whether this phrase comes from the Lord, or the equivalent of that is. Oh, and I suppose I should pull up one other thing. Just Proverbs 16:1. Let me the question is whether this is from the Lord or comes from the Lord or anything else like that, whether that modifies both the preparations of the heart and man and the answer of the tongue, or if they are, or if only the latter should be modified by "it's from the Lord." So the preparation of the heart and man, you would say something like, the preparation of the heart is in man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. That would certainly be.
It's not just is in man; it's from man, belong to man.
Something like that, right?
Is of the man.
So I'm looking through, like, the Bible Gateway lists lots and lots of English translation.
Yeah.
And some of them, I don't know some of these. They list a ton of English translations. Some of them I'm really not familiar with. But many of them will simply say that we'll divide it so that the from the Lord modifies only the second part, and a few of them have it similar to the way that King James has it. Now, in terms of the question, there's an underlying question here of what does the Hebrew actually say, which is obviously more important ultimately than how do the translators translate it. And there we have, now I have to agree with you at least that my Hebrew is really not as it's not even close to being where my Greek understanding is. So I'm relying heavily on the tools. But if relying on the tools that I have, it looks like if we're following the kind of literal word order, this term Adam in a form is found first, and then the term for this that's translated preparations or plans or that kind of term. And then that seems to be modified with of the heart. So in these kind of inward plans, heart plans, the mental preparations, right? And then the next comes the phrase from the Lord, and then comes the answer and the tongue. So linguistically, this from the Lord is right in the middle of the right in the middle of the verse in terms of where it's not that in English we put it at the end, but this form of the tetragrammaton from the Lord, it does lie right there in the center. I can say this much: I'm not familiar enough with Hebrew to say definitively that the word order implies that from the Lord should be applied to both the first half and the second half. So the part that comes before, I guess in Hebrew it's right to left, right? So it's the part to the right of from the Lord. Whether from the Lord should modify that or not, I can't tell definitively myself. I don't have enough Hebrew to tell you to say that, and I would have to be reliant on the translation. I wonder, let's say for the sake of discussion here, unless you have a different take on the Hebrew, let's say for the sake of discussion, I would say that the usual way of dividing, actually, hold on a second. Maybe there's the, where's the conjunction, if there is one? I guess it's embedded in the word in the answer, which comes after. Or is it with the from the Lord? Honestly, the big challenge here is that I don't have a good enough understanding of Hebrew to be definitive in saying which translation is superior. I would say that in terms of the way that Proverbs is often written, it is typical to see, at least it seems as though it's typical to see the each verse, each thought expressed in two different ways. So it wouldn't be at all surprising for me to understand verse 1 as being better translated. To man belongs the preparations of the heart, but to God belong the answer of the tongue.
Right, and that would parallel 9, right? The man's heart devises his way, the Lord directs his steps, and it would parallel 3. Commit your works unto the Lord, and your thoughts will be established, right? So, so I guess I don't have a good answer on. I don't have a good enough grip on the Hebrew at all to be able to answer that one. So I'm going to have to punt. But unfortunately, there's going to be another one, very similar question on verse 4. So So on verse 4, as far as I am aware, but just exegetically before we can even get to the systematics, is going to be three questions. The Lord made all things. What does it mean that He made them? Because in some cases it's more like orchestrated or something like that, and then it's for Himself or for their own purposes or something like that. It's a question. And then what exactly is the day of evil? Which actually I think you noted. So, like if we look at verse 4 in various translations, so let's look at it in just the ESV. The Lord made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble, right? So it's changed the, for His purpose to for its purpose. And some other translations have its own end, its own purpose. Let's see, for a purpose, for its purpose.
I'm sorry. One thing I forgot to mention
Yeah.
on verse 1 is I think I checked the Vulgate. Not that the Vulgate has any special miraculous power, but I did check, and I think that it also divides it like a lot of the other translations do, just for whatever that's worth. Sorry, go ahead.
Interesting. Yeah. So, so it. I think verse 4 is a little bit more evenly split in terms of whether it's the thing's purpose that He creates or for Himself. And I think it ultimately doesn't make too much difference, but I think if you, but it looks like it could be either everything has its own purpose, or the purpose of everything is God Himself. In some ultimate sense, the purpose of everything is God. There's no question about that. There's nothing theologically wrong with the King James translation in this case. It's just that might not be what is being expressed in the verse. It might just be saying everything has its own purpose. But I think the bigger question is what is the day of evil? And I think you touched on that a little bit. So let's elaborate on that a bit. So one thing we can see, you just search the day of evil or the day of trouble or something like that, and most of the references will refer to some big battle, right? Some cataclysmic battle or something like that. Or it could be a reference to some horrific catastrophe, just think like, massive bad things happening, like what happened to Job or something like that. There's actually a day of evil reference in the New Testament, but only one that I'm aware of is in Ephesians, where we're to put on the armor of God in Ephesians 6, and so that we'll be able to stand in the day of evil. And there the sense is, that we're going to get attacked. And then in the Psalms, there's several references to, well, God can be your stronghold in the day of evil, or basically that God will get you through the day of evil. He'll protect you in the day of evil. He'll carry you through the day of evil. That's that sort of language. So it's not obvious to me that it's hell. It could be. It's not even obvious to me that it's a punishment for the wicked. And I think you noted the same thing, that it could be taken in a different sense in terms of, let's say you're the Israelites at this time, and an army is besieging the city of Jerusalem or something like that. Well, God made those people too, right? And yes, they're causing you problems, but it doesn't mean they're from another God, right? They're still from the same God. God made them as well as you, right? And that could be the sense of what's going on here. That might be a better understanding of the day of evil rather than a punishment, or specifically of hellfire. It just seems more in keeping. So what's your overall take on what exactly the day of evil is?
Well, I want to throw one more before we continue.
Okay.
I want to throw one more monkey wrench into the works.
Okay.
Uh, in terms of textual variants, the Proverbs 16 is one of those unusual places where the Septuagint is quite different from the Masoretic text. And so there's not a Septuagint 16:1 in the usual way that things are broken down, and also not a Septuagint 16:3 or 4. There's just a Septuagint 16:2, and then 5, and then 7, and then it kind of continues on. So there's a section here at the beginning of Proverbs where there's some interesting textual variant between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, and maybe in a second we should come back to that. But my answer to your question about what is the day of evil, I understand the day of evil that's mentioned here as having as its my best understanding of the day of evil is that it refers to the day of judgment. But I would say that there are, I would say, let me give you an example of other usage of day of evil, at least in the English, and I don't know if it matches in Hebrew, but in Jeremiah 17, 17, and 18, the prophet Jeremiah says, let's see, starting at verse 15, and again, I am reliant here on the Masoretic text, and there may be, Jeremiah is another place where there's some significant difference between Masoretic and Septuagint. I haven't checked. It says, "Behold, they say unto me, where is the word of the Lord? Let it come now. As for me, I have not hastened from being a pastor to follow thee, neither have I desired the woeful day. Thou knowest, that which came out of my lips was right before thee. Be not a terror unto me. Thou art my hope in the day of evil. Let them be confounded that persecute me, but let me not be confounded. Let them be dismayed, but let not me be dismayed. Bring upon them the day of evil and destroy them with double destruction." There, the day of evil seems to be having, at least as its primary sense, the destruction of the nation, as opposed to the final judgment day. On the other hand, it's not, there's the one is often kind of a view, a preview of the other. So
do you take this to be talking about the impending fall of Jerusalem?
No. I don't think that Solomon was prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem in Proverbs 16.
Oh, I'm sorry. In Jeremiah 17, is that talking about the fall of Jerusalem?
I think so, but I might be mistaken. I think so. Yeah. So, at least as its primary reference.
Right. Yeah. And so in verse 17 and Jeremiah 17:17, "Be not a terror to me, you are my refuge in the day of disaster." Mm-hmm. Right? What do you think he's talking about? I mean, basically that he's going to survive when the city is stormed, right?
Yes.
Right.
Well, not just stormed, but destroyed. Yeah.
Destroyed. Right. And, that God will get him through that day of disaster.
Right.
Yeah. So how are you getting hellfire?
I would still view that. Okay, so I do think that Proverbs 16 has in mind the final judgment of the wicked, not only these these preliminary punishments that come upon the wicked, because I think Proverbs has in mind throughout punishments that God will bring, and that it's not limited to punishments that God will bring in this life. That said, I wouldn't say that Proverbs 16:4 has to be limited to Judgment Day as the day of evil, but that it could refer to any punishment that comes upon the wicked, including things like the destruction of Jerusalem.
But there's a sense in which Jeremiah in 17:17 isn't the one that's being punished. Now he's going to go through the battle, right? But Jeremiah has been faithful, and because he's been faithful, the Lord is going to be his refuge in the day of disaster. So he's going to survive the day of disaster.
Right,
Um,
right. Just
and
as
that,
we'll survive Judgment Day, you and I, God willing.
right, right. That's an interesting way to look at it. So you you look at it as the judgment, not the punishment following the judgment. Is that what you're saying? Because we'll survive Judgment Day, but we wouldn't survive hell, right? Like, we just won't go to hell,
Right.
right?
Yeah, we're not going to experience hell
Right,
in that sense. Yeah.
and in that sense, if hell were the day of disaster, then we're not going to be in the day of disaster. Now, if by the day of disaster you mean God's just judgment,
Yes.
um, I could that doesn't. So the problem is that there that you we're slicing things rather thinly, and maybe I'm not being fair by that. But if we're looking at it as a judgment day simpliciter, apart from the punishment that follows that judgment day, then that's the exact opposite relationship that we would want in this case, because the believers, and in this case Jeremiah, will um, survive the judgment. We'll survive the judgment because we'll be justified by Christ's blood. But we would not survive hell. But in this case, it's the actual invasion that Jeremiah is going to undergo, and the literal destruction of the city. But he's going to survive it. So he's going to make it through the disastrous part.
Yeah, there's two ways he talks about it, 17 and 18. Right? In 17, he talks about it in terms of this day of evil coming, this coming, you could think about it as the coming judgment day. But then in 18, he says, bring upon them the day of evil. But if we're saying that he has hope in the day of evil, isn't it upon him? Well, in a sense it is, and in a sense it isn't. Right? So in one sense, the day of evil is brought upon them in verse 18, and they're destroyed with a double destruction. And that you could think about that in terms of the double destruction. You could just think about it in terms of being an emphatic way of saying in Hebrew, like really, really wipe them out. Or you could think about it in through a gospel lens and think about it in terms of them being destroyed, not only physically, but also cast into hell in terms of verse 18. I think the more obvious solution there is just the double destruction is just kind of a Hebrew way of saying like really, really destroyed. But even so, this idea of bringing upon them the day of evil, there's a sense in which that day of evil is also brought upon Jeremiah in the sense that he's there on that day. I mean, if I recall correctly, the history, he's actually in jail,
In a pit,
and
yeah.
when they come, they liberate him from the jail, and they're like, oh yeah, this is that prophet who was saying to everybody, don't resist. So they let him. He kind of gets really easy treatment at that point.
Right. And so if fleshing that context out a little further for Jeremiah, it was basically a battle of the prophet of God versus false prophets, because there were people saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. We're not going. Jerusalem won't fall. These walls will never be breached." That sort of thing they were saying, and there's like some funny parts where it's like Jeremiah, the king tells Jeremiah, "Oh, you always proclaim this disaster," when Jeremiah is getting the message directly from God, and the false prophets are telling him, "Oh no, everything is going to be fine." And
Are you mixing it up with the Micaiah, the one that was he said Ahab talking with him, or is it the same? Is it just
it's
a
the same.
very similar story?
It's similar. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, that's right. I think the context is the same. So the people that he's saying, um, bring the let's see, those in verse 18, let those who shame me and persecute me, let me not be put to shame. Let them be dismayed. Let me not be dismayed. Bring upon them the day of disaster. Right. So those are the false prophets, and he's basically saying, they're saying there isn't going to be a day of disaster for Jerusalem, but bring it on, and show them Right, and actually we'll see something like that when we get to Isaiah 44. Okay, so let's for the sake of discussion, I think we might have to agree to disagree a little bit on exactly what the day of evil or the day of trouble is. But if it were hellfire, I think then it would be hard for someone that held to libertarian free will to explain this text without Molinism. Now, with Molinism, I think it does still fit. I mean, certainly what the passage is not saying is that God causally determines everything, or that they can't do otherwise, or this sort of thing. But what we do have is a pretty strong statement of divine intention. And when you have Molinism, you can have the same intent on God's part. It's just how God brings about these things. And actually, I had this discussion. I don't know if you've heard of Roger Olson, but he's like a pretty famous in Arminian circles because he wrote a couple books, Arminianism, Myths and Realities, and that sort of thing. And he's pretty convinced that James Arminius wasn't a Molinist, and I'm pretty convinced that he was. And this is one of the places, because I showed him, hey, look at James Arminius's comments on Proverbs 16:4. He basically is saying that this has to be God's middle knowledge of the purpose for wicked people in mind at the time of creation. So Arminius took like he granted everything probably possible to a Calvinist for the sake of argument. He grants it all, but he still says, but even if you take the text at face value, middle knowledge certainly accounts for this. What do you think of the middle knowledge take of Proverbs 16:4?
In terms of, I don't think it makes any significant difference whether the day of evil in mind here is simply a day of destruction, like the destruction of Jerusalem or the Babylonian captivity. I don't think it makes a difference whether that's in mind, that this kind of this physical destruction, like the one in Jeremiah, where they come in and they kill everybody and then throw them in a pit. Whether that's in mind or the punishment associated with Judgment Day is in mind, I think that either way, the second half of the verse is saying that the wicked are made for that purpose, for that intent. Now, I will acknowledge that it's a very summary statement, and it doesn't explicitly say something like, God made them wicked, as opposed to they libertarianly were wicked, and God had middle knowledge of that and took advantage of the situation and so forth. I would suppose that if what you're saying, if the comment about middle knowledge is there any other way for a non-Calvinist position to handle this kind of text other than middle knowledge or other than Molinism, with its reliance on middle knowledge, I can't imagine such a system. In other words, I can't imagine any other way for it to handle. And if middle knowledge and Molinism were a legitimate option, I wouldn't have. I would say this just wouldn't be a verse that would be the differentiator. In other words, this verse doesn't deal with the difference between Molinism and Calvinism.
Right, and so, but let me clarify something just to make sure that you and I agree what's not being said in this verse. We don't. Neither one of us is saying that God creates people wicked. Right? They don't leave the Creator's hand wicked. Right? It's not like Adam was wicked when as soon as God breathed the breath of life into him.
Adam was not created wicked, but Adam's descendants are brought into the world with concupiscence at least. And not even talking about the question of their guilt, but they are brought into the world with concupiscence already. So they are, and God does take credit for the creation of human lives in some sense. It's not quite the same way. It's certainly not even close to the same way in which Adam was created. And part of the reason is that man has a role in the creation of other human beings, right? So there's Adam was not created by humans, nor was Eve, and though Eve was created out of a human, it was before he had sinned. So neither Adam nor Eve was created already sinful. But I don't think that Proverbs 16:4 is talking about the wicked in that sense, in the sense of just having sin or having concupiscence, or tendency towards sin, or this type of thing. I think it is talking about people who are notably wicked. And I don't think that this is saying that they kind of come out of the womb already in that, already as such.
Right, especially if the day of trouble is a battle. You can think of the specific wicked as this army that's coming to destroy the city or something like that.
Yes, so whether they're viewed as the means of punishment or whether they're viewed as the punished ones, either way, God declares that He's behind it and that He has an intent for it. Whether the wicked here are the tool of punishment or the recipient of punishment, either way, God is taking credit for it in some sense. He's saying He made all these things for Himself, or at least that He made these things. If you say that it's not for Himself because of a translation difference of the noun, the pronoun, But anyway, God's taking credit for it and expressing that His intent in it, and that's a challenge for libertarian freedom, aside from the Molinistic understanding of libertarian freedom. So this isn't a differentiating verse between Molinism and Calvinism, but it would be against other forms of non-Calvinist views. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Or
yeah, it does. Yeah, and so just now backing up to what you had said, so or just original sin in the abstract. God doesn't. So setting aside the issue of creationism, transducism, let's say that God creates souls at the time of conception or something like that. Just for the sake of argument, let's say that that's the case. He actually is creating them. We're not Manichaeans. I don't think either one of us would say that there's something physically evil about anybody, and that sort of thing. So He doesn't create the wicked in that sense, and I want to make sure that neither one of us thinks that. And some people will describe sin nature as like something extra, like a growth, a fungus that's growing on top of the person or something like that, on top of the human nature. But others would describe it as, no, there's something fundamentally missing that people don't have. Now, either way, there's a sin nature and this propensity to sin, and there's also a guilt by association to Adam, not having actually committed the sins ourselves, but corporately is in Adam that we contract that guilt. But that's not an individual wickedness in the same sense as committing a sinful act yourself. So God doesn't create the wicked in that sense, in terms of committing evil acts themselves. And the Bible even will talk about, I think it's in 1 Corinthians, that we should be as innocent as babies. And we should, right? Because babies don't, scheme up wicked stuff, right? So they're not the wicked in that sense, even though they have a sin nature that is has a propensity to sin, and they're corporately guilty in Adam. So I just want to make sure that neither one of us are saying that God is creating wicked people.
The way that the Westminster Confession describes this, This is the not the this isn't the confession itself. This is the larger catechism. The question 25 of the larger catechism asks, wherein consists the sinfulness of that estate whereinto man fell? And the answer that's provided is the sinfulness of that estate whereinto man fell consists in the guilt of Adam's first sin, which isn't necessarily reflected, in the person's creation as such, right? They may be created guilty, but being created guilty is different from being created in some way defective or anything like that. But then additionally, it also includes the absence of that righteousness wherein Adam was created, and the corruption of his nature, whereby he is utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite unto all that is spiritually good, and wholly inclined to all evil, and that continually, which is commonly called original sin, and from which do proceed all actual transgressions. So that's the if you're saying neither of us hold to that, then I would disagree. I don't know whether you hold to that view of original sin or some other view.
So it's slightly different, I guess. No, so again, it comes down to this, that original sin is a missing of original righteousness. The help and assistance that Adam and Eve received in the garden is no longer there for us, and that's why we have this propensity to sin. So that is a slightly different than the Reformed view, or at least the way some Reformers, but it's so subtle that that's not the, so actually I think we just talked about that. So like, is evil, like let's say a moth eats a hole in your shirt, right? Is evil the missing aspect of your shirt, the hole, in the shirt? Or is it like moss that's growing on top of your shirt? Which one is it? Is evil this added physical, added thingy, or is it a missing something, right? I tend to look at it more as it's a missing thingy. And I believe that was Augustine's view. But some of the reformers clash with the Roman Catholics on this point, and they wanted to describe it in more of a positive terms, in terms of original sin, and sin nature is kind of like this evil that's growing on man, or something like that. And they wouldn't use those words, by the way. but that's like a super technical whatever. So we could have a whole different episode just on that. That's not the point. The point, and I think the point that I want to make sure is clear, is that when God creates something, it's good, right? And it doesn't leave His hand evil, because if it did, if God is literally creating wickedness, then that's, I think the problem of evil is completely solvable at that point. And it wouldn't even be, is God the author of sin? It would be, is God the creator of sin at that point?
Okay.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. We can circle back to original sin, which is, there's some specific texts that we should look at if we're going to look at original sin on some other day. But so to back to this point, the Lord has made everything for its purpose, even for the wicked, for the day of trouble. So whatever the day of trouble means, whether it's a punishment or whether it's basically trouble that's being inflicted on the Israelites from outside or invading forces, or on Christians who are putting on the armor of God. Either way, you're right that there's this purpose and intention for wicked individuals, and God is kind of directing and guiding those sort of things. And you need a strong view of providence, which I think only either Molinism or Calvinism could accomplish. So I think it would be hard. I think if you, I have seen open theists try to interpret this passage, but their explanations don't make sense to me. I read Greg Boyd on the passage, and he basically said, well, it's kind of like a template. God has a plan to punish anyone that does evil, right? No matter who it is, that God has but the intentionality is more behind this and from further back than that, and stronger than, if you do something bad, God will punish you. In essence, he resolved the passage into, if you do something bad, God will punish you. And I think it has to mean much more than that in terms of God's providential control. Anyways, that's my 2 cents.
All right. Okay, I'm back with, this is the Vulgate. Well, there we go. It's the Vulgate. I'm sorry, it's probably getting censored by my filter. The Masoretic text, okay, and the Septuagint text.
Okay.
And I also have a Septuagint with a translation of the Septuagint text.
Wonderful tools.
Yeah, it should be helpful for this, because you highlighted to me, I think right before or at the beginning of our discussion, that there's some textual issue with Proverbs 26:10. And if it's okay with you, I'll just read it quickly in the King James Version, which is the version I mentioned to you last time.
Sure.
And that was, the great God that formed all things both rewards the fool and rewards transgressors. And as best as I can see, a lot of the modern translations, such as the ESV, omit this verse. And I'm not 100% sure why.
No, I don't think they omit it. They just translate it radically different.
Well, let's see.
So,
well, it's something about an archer.
Right.
Let me jump ahead. Let me jump to.
So while you're reading that, just in a couple of commentaries that I looked up, but one of them. So this is the Cambridge Bible Commentary. There are a number of variety of interpretations that have been given, but the RV notes say the Hebrew is obscure, right? Literally, that's the translator notes, right? Like, they don't know, and the translations are all over the place. I mean, they're just everywhere. I don't think it's a textual variant. I mean, there might be a textual variant also, but I think in one of the commentaries it actually said, like, literally every single word is in the passage is obscure.
Huh. Let me go back then, since it doesn't appear to be a textual issue, and it's certainly not based on selecting between the Hebrew and the Greek. Or I guess let's take a quick. So the King James.
Well, let me ask this. Let's for the sake of argument, I just want to hear you out. Like, let's say the King James is correct. I don't even see how this supports Calvinism, even if the King James is correct. So what argument, or what's your take on it? Assuming that the King James is right, what do you think it means? And how would it support Calvinism?
So I will give another disclaimer before I say anything else, which is, based on the point that you raised of this, there seemed to be, and I haven't carefully studied it, but there does seem to be some question about what exactly the Hebrew means, and we don't have a great ancient witness aside, to parallel the Hebrew here in terms of having a Greek translation for us. So the text may be a little bit obscure, and that wouldn't be a great verse on which to build a lot of doctrine, especially not on a fine point of translation, if that's indeed what it is. And I look at some of the other translations, a number of them seem to be following this idea of that it has to do with somebody who who shoots wild. It's a similarity between someone shooting randomly, an archer shooting randomly, and somebody hiring a fool to do a job. So something like that. If I saw some of the other translations, so I would say, first of all, if those other translations are correct or approximate, then it really has nothing to do with our topic. Particularly, it has to do with the wisdom of hiring, idiots to do, to do their job. So that's that's a huge disclaimer up front. But the reason that I had thought of it as this in terms of the Calvinism debate is the fact that in the same sentence with the idea of God rewarding fools and transgressors, which are in Proverbs basically parallel concepts. The people who are sinful and foolish are essentially the same thing. There's not a huge difference. It's two ways of saying the same thing. But in that same sentence of talking about rewarding them, meaning punishing them, the great God is described as forming all things. So there's a sense in which, at least implicitly, God is taking credit for the fool and transgressors as well as everything else, because he's not just the great God that formed all the good things, but he's the great God that formed all things. That was the sense in which I was understanding this text, based on the English, without carefully checking to make sure that it was the original meaning as well. And we've highlighted the danger of doing that partly by, maybe the King James Version is right on this, but if it's not, if the other alternative meanings are correct, then it has nothing at all to do with what I've just talked about. So, that would be it's not something I would want to spend a lot of time on. And right. Indeed, we're giving it short shrift here, I hope.
Right. Okay. So, I'm a monist, but let's say even an open theist would agree that God creates everything and he rewards fools and transgressors.
I would question, unless it's some weird process theology kind of open theist, the way in which open theists would say God forms fools and transgressors. I mean, it seems as though at least some of them have an idea of God that's more like he kind of wound up the clock and everything went from there with very little basically, as far as God knows, people could just stop making babies of their own free will and nobody else would get formed, because it's all, only the very initial act of creation is something that was in God's hands and everything else is man's free will. At least, I would think that would be an issue. But to me, the bigger issue is God, if this indeed means what it seems to mean in English, in the King James Version, the issue to me would have been that God seems to be taking credit for the fools and transgressors and not just the good stuff.
So you see an implication that God creates fools and transgressors because I think it's in the King James, it's just saying a couple different thoughts. God is the one that creates everything, right? The great God who formed all things both rewards the fools and rewards transgressors. He does both of those rewardings, right? And I don't think it's directly saying God created fools and transgressors. And if it is, by implication, I mean, of course it's true that God created everything. So that includes fools and that includes transgressors. But it's not saying God created them as fools and God created them as transgressors. And that would be similar to the discussion we had, I guess, a little bit on the original sin.
Yeah. So I wouldn't want to invest, I appreciate your thoughts on it as well. I wouldn't want to invest additional time of ours on that particular verse, given its the textual issues behind it. I think the other translation also makes a lot of sense, but as well, if indeed the Hebrew is obscure. And as I said, I'm not equipped to contest that point. The tool I have makes it look like the King James is right, but the tool I have generally almost always makes it look like the King James right because the way the tool is made. So it's not the most reliable. It's not great for. It's great to a point for checking the King James version, but only to a point. So
my Hebrew is like an archer who wounds somebody randomly, and if somebody hires me to translate the Old Testament into English, they are hiring a fool.
yeah, this verse randomly wounds Calvinists who cite it. So, if they're not careful about how they cite it. So maybe next time we can get into the Isaiah passage. I think it would be much more reliable in terms of its translation.
Yeah.
I hope it's much more reliable.
Yeah.
Isaiah in general is. So.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, very good. Excellent discussion as always. I appreciate your time and thoughts on all these matters. Good stuff. So God be with you.
And also with you.